I used to think the worst moment of my life was standing in that church doorway, bouquet shaking in my hands, watching every guest turn around expecting to see my father, and seeing nothing, just an empty aisle. But that wasn't the worst moment. The worst moment came weeks later, sitting in Pastor Ellison's office, when he said completely casually, "Well, after what was offered to your father, I understood why he stepped back." He looked up, saw my face go white, and the color drained from his too, because nobody had told me. Not my father, not my mother, not even my husband. My own father had been purchased like a transaction, and the woman who bought him had cried at my wedding. If your own family ever made you feel like you weren't worth showing up for, drop a broken heart in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed, because this story is going to shake you. My name is Vivienne. I'm 31 years old, and I grew up in a small house on the edge of Dayton, Ohio, where the kitchen always smelled like burnt coffee and everything important was left unsaid. My father, Gerald, was not a warm man. He wasn't the kind of dad who showed up to recitals or remembered birthdays without being reminded. But he was present, physically there, sitting at the dinner table, watching the evening news, existing in the same rooms as us. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. That presence without tenderness still counted for something. I was wrong about that too, but I didn't find that out until my wedding day. I got married on a Saturday in April. The venue was a small chapel in downtown Dayton, cream walls, wooden pews, morning light coming through old stained glass, and throwing colored shadows across the floor. I had spent 8 months planning every detail. The flowers were white peonies. The dress had taken me 4 tries to find. My best friend and maid of honor, Claudette, had driven 6 hours from Nashville just to be there with me. The morning started quietly. I was in the bridal suite at the back of the chapel, and Claudette was doing my hair, and everything felt almost unbearably beautiful. Almost. Because underneath all of it, there was this low hum of anxiety that I couldn't quite silence. My father hadn't called, hadn't texted. He was supposed to arrive by 10 to take photos before the ceremony. It was 10:47. "He's probably just running late," Claudette said, catching my eyes in the mirror. She was using her calm voice, the one she only used when she was actually worried. "Yeah," I said. "Probably traffic." I called him at 11. Voicemail. I called again at 11:15. Voicemail. By 11:30, my hands were not steady anymore. Claudette had taken my phone away and was texting him herself, which meant she'd moved past the stage of pretending everything was fine and into the stage of quietly trying to fix it before I fully fell apart. The ceremony was at noon. At 11:44, my phone buzzed. Claudette handed it to me without a word, and I looked down and saw my father's name on the screen, and I felt something unlock in my chest. Relief, pure and rushing. And I answered immediately. "Dad, where are you? Everyone's been, Vivienne." His voice was flat, not rushed, not apologetic, just flat. Like he was calling to cancel a lunch reservation. "I'm not coming." The room went very quiet. Or maybe it was just me that went quiet. I'm not sure. "What?" I said. Just that one word. Because my brain had genuinely stopped processing. "I can't be there today. I'm sorry." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man who had already made his peace with something and was now just completing the formality of informing me. "Dad, the wedding starts in—" "I know when it starts, Vivienne." "Then why—" My voice cracked. I hated that it cracked. "Why are you doing this? What happened? Are you sick? Is something wrong?" A pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I just can't do it. I'm sorry." And then he hung up. I stood there holding the phone for what felt like a very long time. Claudette was watching me from across the room with an expression I will never forget. This mixture of fury and heartbreak and helplessness. She crossed the room in 3 steps and took both my hands in hers and said, "Listen to me. You are getting married today. You hear me? This is your day, not his." I nodded, because what else was there to do? My mother's brother, my Uncle Terrence, walked me down the aisle. He was 62 years old, and he held my arm so carefully, like I was something fragile, like he understood without being told that I was barely holding myself together inside this dress. As we stood at the back of the chapel, and the doors opened, and the music started, and every face in those pews turned toward me, I smiled. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt, because I was not going to let anyone in that room see me break. Not on this day. Not in this dress. Not with Damien standing at the end of that aisle, looking at me like I was the only thing in the world worth looking at. I walked toward my husband. I kept my eyes on his face, and I did not look at the empty space in the front row where my father was supposed to be sitting. I almost made it through without crying. Almost. The reception was held in a banquet hall 3 blocks from the chapel. String lights, round tables with white linen, a DJ who played all the right songs at all the right moments. From the outside, it looked like the most beautiful evening, and I worked very hard to make sure it stayed that way. I laughed at the toasts. I danced with Damien until my feet hurt. I cut the cake and smiled for every photograph and hugged every guest who came to congratulate us. I was performing, and I knew I was performing, but the performance was the only thing keeping me upright. The moment I stopped moving, stopped smiling, stopped filling every second with something, the thing waiting underneath would come through, and I couldn't let it. Not yet. Damien knew. He always knew. Somewhere between the first dance and the dinner, he leaned close to my ear and said quietly, "We don't have to stay till the end. Say the word." And I shook my head and squeezed his hand and said, "I'm okay." He didn't believe me, but he let me have it. It was Claudette who finally pulled me into the bathroom near the end of the night. She locked the door, turned to face me, and said, "Talk." And that was when I cried. Finally, properly cried. The ugly kind. The kind that doesn't care about mascara or dignity. I sat on the edge of that bathroom counter in my wedding dress, and I cried for about 4 minutes straight, while Claudette stood in front of me with her hand on my back, saying nothing, just being there. And then I washed my face with cold water, fixed what I could fix, and walked back out into my reception. That was the last time I cried about it for a while. Because after that night, what I felt wasn't sadness anymore. It was something quieter and colder, and much harder to name. The week after the wedding, I called my father 3 times. He didn't answer once. I left one voicemail, calm, measured, just asking him to call me back when he was ready to talk. He never did. I called my mother, Lorraine, instead. My parents had been divorced since I was 14, but they still spoke occasionally, still moved in the same loose orbit of family events and holiday obligations. If anyone knew what was going on with Gerald, it was her. "Your father is complicated, Vivienne," she said, in that particular tired tone she'd been using about him for 20 years. "You know how he gets. Mom, he didn't come to my wedding." "I know, baby." "That's not complicated. That's a choice." A long pause. "Just give him some time. He'll come around." She said it like he'd missed a birthday dinner, like this was a normal Gerald thing. A small withdrawal, a brief disappearance, and not the single most painful thing he had ever done to me. I got off the phone feeling more alone than before I called. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Damien was patient and present, but I could see the anger sitting just behind his eyes every time my father's name came up. He never pushed, never told me what to do, but I knew he was waiting for me to decide what I wanted this to mean for our lives going forward. The thing that cracked everything open didn't come from my father or my mother. It came from my younger sister, Becca. Becca was 26, still living in Dayton, still in that complicated orbit of trying to stay close to both parents without upsetting either one. She had been at the wedding. She had hugged me at the reception and whispered, "I'm so sorry about Dad," and I had nodded and moved on because I couldn't afford to stop moving. She called me on a Thursday evening, about a month after the wedding. We were just talking, nothing heavy, just catching up. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, she mentioned that she'd run into a family friend, a woman named Phyllis, who had apparently seen Gerald at a restaurant the night of my wedding. A nice restaurant, the kind Gerald never went to on his own, because he always said the prices were ridiculous. Phyllis said he was with some older woman, Becca said. Casual, like it was just gossip. Really well dressed, apparently. Phyllis didn't recognize her. I went very still. "What restaurant?" I asked. Becca told me. It was 40 minutes from the chapel. 40 minutes from where I had stood in a doorway waiting for him. "What time?" I asked. "I don't know, Vivienne." Phyllis didn't say exactly. Becca, my voice came out sharper than I intended. Approximately what time? A pause. She said she was there for an early dinner, so maybe around 6? 6:30? The ceremony had started at noon. The reception ran until 10. My father had been at a restaurant. A nice restaurant, with a well-dressed woman nobody recognized, in the middle of my wedding day. Not home. Not sick. Not dealing with some private emergency he couldn't explain. At a dinner, with someone. My hand was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. Because I knew, the way you know things in your stomach before your brain catches up, that this was not a coincidence. This was something else entirely. This was a piece of something much larger and much darker than a father simply choosing not to show up. I just didn't know yet how dark it actually was. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to Damien, listening to him breathe, and I turned that one detail over and over in my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. A nice restaurant. A well-dressed woman nobody recognized. 6 o'clock on my wedding day. I tried to build innocent explanations around it. Maybe it was an old friend. Maybe it was a work contact. Though Gerald hadn't held a steady job in 3 years, so that fell apart quickly. Maybe it was a date. Some woman he'd met online, and he was too embarrassed to tell anyone he'd chosen that over my wedding. That explanation was painful enough, but something in my gut kept rejecting it. The restaurant was too nice. The timing was too precise. And my father, a man who considered Applebee's a special occasion, did not take women he barely knew to places like that on his own dime. Someone else had paid for that dinner. The thought arrived quietly, and then just sat there, immovable. I started paying closer attention after that. I went back through small things I'd dismissed before the wedding. Moments I'd filed away as unimportant because I was too consumed with centerpieces and catering menus to examine them properly. Like the phone call 3 months before the wedding when I'd mentioned the venue to Gerald and he'd gone oddly quiet. Or the way he'd hesitated when I asked him to practice what he'd say walking me down the aisle. A long, strange hesitation before he said, "We'll figure it out, Vivienne." I'd thought he was just being emotionally avoidant the way he always was. Now I wondered if he already knew, even then, that he was never going to be there. I also started thinking about Constance. Damien's mother, Constance Aldridge, was a 63-year-old woman who had spent the majority of our 2-year relationship making it quietly, consistently clear that she did not think I was right for her son. Not loudly, not cruelly enough that anyone could point to a specific moment and say, "There, that was it." She was too careful for that. It was in the way she looked at me at family dinners, that polite, measuring look that never quite warmed. In the comments about my apartment before Damien and I moved in together. "It's cozy," she'd said, in a tone that meant something else entirely. In the way she'd asked me, twice, in separate conversations, whether I was sure I was ready for the kind of life Damien had built for himself. I had never told Damien how much those moments had accumulated. I didn't want to be the woman who created problems between a man and his mother. So I smiled, and I was gracious, and I told myself it would get better after the wedding. But now I was thinking about Constance differently. I was thinking about the fact that she came from money, old, quiet, Dayton-adjacent money that she never flaunted but never forgot either. I was thinking about the fact that Gerald had a gambling debt that had been quietly swallowing him for years, something only our immediate family knew about, or so I thought. And I was thinking about that well-dressed woman at the restaurant that nobody recognized. I didn't have proof. I had a feeling and a collection of small details that hadn't meant anything on their own. But together, in the sleepless dark of 3 in the morning, they were starting to form a shape. It was 10 days later that I went to see Pastor Ellison. Pastor Ellison had known our family for nearly 15 years. He'd presided over my grandparents' funeral, counseled my mother through the divorce, and when Damien and I got engaged, it was him we'd asked to perform the ceremony without a second thought. He was a quiet, careful man in his late 60s with kind eyes and the particular gentleness of someone who had sat with people through the worst moments of their lives for decades. I went to see him about scheduling a small marriage blessing ceremony, something intimate, just Damien and me, a quiet prayer and a moment of intention now that the chaos of the wedding had settled. It was Damien's idea, actually. A way to reclaim something peaceful after the day had been fractured. Pastor Ellison welcomed me into his office with that familiar warmth, offered me coffee, and we sat and talked easily for a few minutes about the wedding, about Damien, about how I was settling into married life. And then, naturally, inevitably, the conversation moved toward my father. "I was sorry Gerald wasn't there," Pastor Ellison said. Genuine, measured. I'd hoped things would work out differently. Hoped, I said. Something about that word snagged in my chest. He nodded slowly. Well, given everything that was being navigated in the weeks before, he paused and took a slow sip of his coffee. After what was offered to him, I understood why he felt he was in an impossible position, though I did tell him what I thought about it. He looked up then, looked directly at my face, and stopped. The office went completely silent. Vivienne, he said, very carefully, you know about this. It wasn't a question. It was a man checking, desperately, whether he had just made a catastrophic mistake. I set my coffee cup down on his desk with a steadiness that surprised even me. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. But my voice, when it came, was absolutely calm. Pastor Ellison, I said, I think you need to tell me everything. Pastor Ellison aged 10 years in about 30 seconds. I watched it happen, watched the color leave his face, watched his hands settle flat on the desk like he needed something solid to hold on to, watched his eyes move through about 6 different emotions before landing on something that looked like resigned, sorrowful honesty. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I owe you the truth. I should have called you myself when it happened. I've carried guilt about that since April. Then tell me, I said, all of it. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and began. About 6 weeks before the wedding, Gerald had come to see him. Alone, unannounced, on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald was not a particularly religious man. He attended church on Easter and Christmas and funerals, and that was about the extent of it. So his showing up at the pastor's office on a random Tuesday was already unusual. But what he said when he sat down was more unusual still. Gerald told Pastor Ellison that someone had approached him with an offer, a significant sum of money. Pastor Ellison didn't know the exact amount, Gerald hadn't said, in exchange for Gerald absenting himself from the wedding entirely, not just stepping back from walking me down the aisle. Disappearing from the day altogether. No ceremony, no reception, no contact with me on that day. He came to me because he was conflicted, Pastor Ellison said. He wanted someone to tell him what to do. Or perhaps he wanted someone to give him permission. I'm still not entirely sure which. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him that no amount of money was worth what he would lose with you, that a daughter's wedding day was not a transaction, that he would spend the rest of his life regretting it. He paused. He listened very politely, and then he took the money anyway. The room tilted slightly. Or maybe that was just me. Did he tell you who made the offer? I asked. Pastor Ellison hesitated, just briefly. He didn't say a name directly, but he described her. An older woman, very composed, very deliberate in how she spoke. He said she'd contacted him privately, that she knew about his financial situation, and that she'd made it clear the offer was generous enough to clear what he owed. Another pause. He seemed almost impressed by her, which I found deeply troubling. I knew. Before he finished the sentence, I already knew. But I needed to hear myself say it out loud. Constance Aldridge, I said. Pastor Ellison looked at me for a long moment and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I drove home on autopilot. I don't remember the traffic or the turns or parking the car. I remember sitting in my driveway for a long time with the engine off, staring at my own front door, trying to organize what I was feeling into something I could actually work with. Because underneath the shock, and there was shock, real and physical, a kind of full-body disbelief, underneath all of that was something much more focused, much colder. I was not going to fall apart. I was going to be very, very careful about what I did next. I went to my father first. Gerald lived in a rental apartment on the east side of Dayton, a second-floor unit in a building that always smelled faintly of other people's cooking. I knocked on his door on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something trapped. Vivienne, he said. I know about the money, Dad, I said. Can I come in? It wasn't a question. He stepped back and let me in. The apartment was clean but sparse. Gerald had never been a man who accumulated things. We sat at his small kitchen table, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he put his face in his hands and he said, I'm sorry, Vivienne. I'm so sorry. Don't. I said quietly. Don't start with sorry. Start with the truth. And he told me. haltingly, painfully, with long silences between sentences where I could see him wrestling with shame that had nowhere left to hide. Constance had contacted him 2 months before the wedding. She'd been thorough. She knew about the gambling debt, knew the exact amount he owed, knew the name of the man he owed it to. Gerald had never understood how she'd gotten that information. She'd offered him enough to clear the debt entirely and have a remainder left over, in exchange for one thing. Stay away from the wedding. Make it look like a personal choice. Tell no one the real reason, she said. He stopped, swallowed. She said that Damien deserved a fresh start, without complications. The word hit me like something physical. Complications. That was what I was to Constance Aldridge. Not a daughter-in-law, not a person her son loved. A complication to be managed. A variable to be quietly eliminated from an equation she'd already decided the answer to. And you agreed, I said. He couldn't look at me. The debt was, I'm not asking about the debt, Dad. My voice was very quiet. I'm asking if you agreed. A long silence. Yes, he said. I sat with that for a moment. Just let it exist in the room between us. That single syllable and everything it contained. Then I stood up, picked up my bag, and looked at my father one last time. I needed you that day more than I have ever needed anything, I said. And you sold that. I walked out and closed the door behind me, gently. No slam, no scene. The gentleness was intentional, because I wasn't done yet. I spent 3 days thinking before I made my next move. 3 days of waking up early and sitting with my coffee in the kitchen while Damien slept, turning everything over in my mind with the kind of cold precision that only arrives when you've moved completely past grief and into something else entirely. Something clear-eyed and purposeful. I hadn't told Damien yet. That was deliberate. Not because I didn't trust him. I trusted him completely, but because I needed to be certain before I placed something this heavy into his hands. I needed more than a pastor's careful implication and a broken father's confession. I needed Constance herself. The thing about Constance Aldridge was that she was extraordinarily confident in her own invisibility. She had operated her entire life behind a veneer of gracious composure, the kind of woman who could devastate you with perfect manners and never leave a fingerprint. She had approached my father privately, paid him quietly, and then sat in the front pew of my wedding and wept during the vows. Actual tears. I had seen them. I had thought, in that moment, that perhaps I had misjudged her. That perhaps she was moved by her son's happiness in ways she couldn't express to me directly. Those tears meant something entirely different to me now. I called her on a Monday and suggested we have lunch, just the two of us, daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, an olive branch extended. I kept my voice warm and slightly vulnerable, told her I wanted us to have a fresh start, that I didn't want the tension of the past to follow Damien and me into our marriage. She accepted with exactly the kind of gracious enthusiasm that told me she believed she had won, that whatever she had engineered had worked, and now I was coming to her softened and seeking approval. She had no idea who she was having lunch with anymore. We met at a restaurant she chose. Of course she chose it. A quiet, upscale place in the suburbs with well-spaced tables and low lighting. I arrived first. I ordered sparkling water, and I made sure my phone was recording before she sat down. Constance was impeccable as always. Cream blouse, pearl earrings, that particular smile she wore like armor. We ordered. We made small talk. And then, very gently, very naturally, I steered the conversation toward the wedding, toward my father's absence. I let my voice go soft and a little wounded. Not difficult, because the wound was entirely real. And I said, I've been struggling with it, honestly. I still don't fully understand why he didn't come. Constance tilted her head with practiced sympathy. These things are complicated, Vivienne. Family dynamics, they're never simple. I know, I said. I just keep wondering if something pushed him in that direction. Someone, maybe. I looked down at my water glass. He's never been great with money, and someone who knew that could have, I don't know, taken advantage. A beat of silence. I didn't look up immediately. I let it breathe. When I did look up, something had shifted almost imperceptibly in Constance's expression. The smile was still there, but it had gone slightly careful around the edges. I think you give people too much credit, dear, she said. Your father made his own choice. He did, I agreed. But I think he had help making it. Another silence, longer this time. And then, because she was confident, because she believed she was untouchable, because she had never once in her life been truly held accountable for anything. She said, "Vivienne, I did what I thought was best for my son. Damien has worked his entire life to build something stable. I simply didn't want that destabilized by complications." There it was, the same word my father had used, complications, straight from her mouth, directly into my recording. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip and set it back down and said, "Thank you for lunch, Constance. This was very helpful." I showed Damien the recording that evening. I sat him down at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd been drinking my early morning coffee for 3 days, holding this alone. And I placed my phone between us and pressed play. I watched his face while he listened, watched the confusion become attention, become understanding, become something I had never seen on him before. A cold, quiet fury that he held very still inside his body. When it finished, he didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, "She paid your father." "Yes, to not walk you down the aisle." "Yes." He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to me and his hands in his pockets. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. "Vivienne, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that happened in my family. To you." I crossed the room and took his face in my hands and said, "This is not yours to carry, but I need you to know the truth, all of it." He nodded. "What do you want to do?" "I want her to be accountable," I said. Not loudly, not dramatically. I just want her to be accountable. Damien handled it himself. He went to his mother without warning, without an audience, without me present, because that was his relationship to repair or dissolve, and I respected that boundary completely. I don't know exactly what was said in that room. Damien has never given me a word-for-word account, and I've never asked for one. What I know is that he came home 2 hours later, sat beside me on the couch, took my hand and said, "She won't be a problem anymore." Constance's grip on the family loosened in the months that followed in ways that were quiet but unmistakable. The weekly dinners where her word had been the final one, gone. The financial leverage she'd held over certain decisions in Damien's life, dismantled, carefully and permanently. She still existed in our orbit, but she no longer controlled it. My father I handled differently. I didn't scream at him. I didn't cut him off in a dramatic declaration. I wrote him a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, every word chosen carefully. I told him what his absence had cost me, not just on the wedding day, but in the years before it. Every moment I had made myself smaller to accommodate his emotional limitations, every time I had excused his distance as personality rather than recognizing it as a choice. I told him that I forgave him, not for his sake, but because I refused to carry his decision in my body for the rest of my life. And I told him that forgiveness was not the same as continuation, that I wished him well from a very great distance. I sealed that letter and mailed it and never sent another one. There are moments, still, when I think about that church doorway, the bouquet shaking in my hands, every face turning toward an empty entrance. I won't pretend it doesn't still hurt. It does, in the particular way that certain wounds never fully close, they just stop bleeding. But here is what I also know now. I know exactly who showed up for me. Claudette, who drove 6 hours and held my hands in a bathroom and said nothing except what needed to be said. Uncle Terrence, who offered his arm without being asked and walked me down that aisle with more dignity than Gerald ever could have managed. And Damien, who looked at me from the end of that aisle like I was the only thing worth looking at, and who has looked at me exactly that way every day since. The woman who bought my father's absence wanted to diminish my wedding day. She wanted the memory to be one of abandonment and humiliation, something I would flinch from every time it came up for the rest of my marriage. Instead, it became the day I found out exactly what I was made of. And I'll take that. I will absolutely take that.